Welcome everyone to this ECOAX webinar on the future of climate risk, strategies for compliance and beyond. Just a few housekeeping before we get started. Please note that the webinar is being recorded. We'll share the recording following the webinar once completed. And we'll also have a questions and answer session at the end of the webinar. So please feel free to input your questions in the QA functionality at any point through the webinar and later on in the Q&A session. If you have any questions, please feel free to just put them at any time. So we go to the next slide, please. Maria Suñé, I'm Managing Consultant at ECOACT, and I'll be facilitating the session today. And I have with me three colleagues, three great panelists who will cover all the topics on climate risk. So we have Omar Farouk, technical expert on transition risk from the Northern Europe region. We have Victoria Naipal from the Southern Europe region, expert on physical risk, and Charlotte Mendes, expert on climate risk and sustainability from Schneider Electric Sustainability Business. So between the four of us, we'll take you through all the key aspects on climate risk in terms of complying with new regulation and strategies beyond that. So we go to the next slide in terms of the agenda that we have prepared for today. I'll get us started with an introduction and setting the stage on the regulatory landscape. Then we'll cover physical risks and transition risks. And then we'll go through beyond the regulatory landscape and how this is an important strategic move for organizations. And finally, how to integrate climate risk into sustainability efforts. We'll wrap up at the end with a Q&A session. So please do feel free to input your questions at any point. So to get us started, we thought we would quickly go through the regulatory. So we go through. In the last few years, we've seen a significant change in reporting requirements on climate-related issues across many of the geographies since the establishment of the TCFD, which is a task force on climate-related financial disclosures back in 2015, with the purpose of improving reporting for climate-related financial information. We've seen an uptake on the importance and reporting of climate risks and opportunities across many geographies. TCFD now has been widely used and is being replaced by the International Financial Reporting Standard S2 globally in the future years. IFRS S2 was developed and approved by the International Sustainability Standards Board. Apologies for all the acronyms. I need to get them out at the beginning of the webinar. And it's going to become, hopefully become, a way in which we standardize reporting on climate risk and be more robust and transparent on what companies are experiencing and how they're planning to respond to this. The final key framework that I wanted to mention as part of this introduction is the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which covers all the topics within ESG and includes specific indicators to report on climate. So these three frameworks are representing and will continue to represent kind of key reporting requirements for companies and trying to align and make sure that we're more robust in the way that we analyze, address, and report on climate risks. Next slide, please. Oh, previous one. So as I mentioned, climate reporting is increasing and becoming more important across many geographies around the world. We've seen national regulations and legislation being implemented in recent years, which you can see on the map here. And actually, rather than me covering each of these in detail, I'd like to go through my colleagues who cover a wide range of geographies to just tell us in 2 short sentences what these new regulations mean for the different geographies. So Omar, maybe if you could get us started with UK landscape.
Sure, thank you, Maria. So the UK has been quite an early adopter of climate-related reporting disclosure requirements. It started off with the TCFD requirements, which mainly apply to listed companies or companies regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. For the Americans in the chat, that's the SEC's equivalent of in the UK, and those companies are required to produce climate-related disclosures in line with the TCFD's requirements. Beyond that, companies above a certain size, both in terms of employees and in terms of revenue, who are not listed, would also be required to prepare climate-related financial disclosures, which in a format that's referred to as climate-related financial disclosures, or CFD. The recommendations of that are also pretty aligned with the TCFD's one, although some minor differences do exist. And those are the two main mechanisms by which climate-related reporting is mandated in the UK.
Thank you. Yes, pretty aligned with TCFD. What about EU CSRD, Victoria?
Yes, so in the EU, you have the CSRD, as you have mentioned before, so the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which entered into force in January last year, and basically obliges all large companies and listed companies in the EU to report on important information on risks and opportunities, not only to climate, like in general, on environment and people, and also to report on the impacts that the companies may have on people and the environment. So this includes climate and climate-related impacts also. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess one of the most comprehensive and wide disclosure requirements that we have at the moment. So finally, Charlotte, there's been quite a lot of talk about SEC in North America. So I don't know if you could tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, so back in March, the SEC actually adopted several climate disclosure requirements related to risks and climate issues. So the new rules really include disclosures relating to climate-related risks and risk management, as well as the board and management's governance of these climate risks. And in addition to this, we have in California the Senate Bill 253 and 261. So the first one, 253, is known as the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act. And this basically requires any large business with operations in California to publicly report their emissions. And then the second Senate Bill 261, this is known as the Climate-Related Financial Risk Act, and this actually mandates companies to disclose their climate risks. Keeping in mind, about a week ago, we were expecting maybe some delays. This did not happen, so these requirements are set to begin as of 2026.
Thank you. Yeah, so this emphasizes, I guess, the urgency and the importance to really get a good understanding of climate risk and opportunities. And it's interesting to see that across geographies, the requirements are broadly aligned, but with some differences that one needs to be aware of. So if we move to the next slide, we just wanted to set the context on regulation requirements and the fact that there's quite a lot of commonalities. So all these frameworks, regulations, they require organizations to understand both their physical and transition risk, which are the two main groups of climate risk that we tend to assess. Before we get started deep diving into this type of risk, just wanted to kind of provide a broad definition of this one. So physical risks are those risks that relate to the direct impacts from weather and climate phenomena on a business. It can be on the buildings, on employees, on its assets, on its supply chain. And these are experienced either through acute physical risks, which are those related to extreme weather events, such as floods, heat waves, wildfires, and other climate disasters, or through chronic physical risks, which are those that occur from a gradual change in the climate. So that could be an average change in temperature having an impact on agriculture yields, or changes in rainfall seasonal patterns. Then we have the other key type of risk, which is the transition risk, and those risks relate to the efforts to transition to a low carbon economy. So these risks might encompass new regulations, such as new carbon taxes, market developments, changes in energy prices, volatility in the energy market, technological breakthrough as we try to move to low carbon technologies, and potentially reputational issues with more importance into kind of greenwashing and other reputational risks. We tend to focus a lot on risks, but we should not forget that there are also opportunities that organizations need to take into account, which would arise from the efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So we've so far covered kind of the regulatory requirements, the type of risks, and we'll now move into a bit more explanation on physical and transition risk. Last point I wanted to mention before I hand over to Victoria is that it's important for organization to understand this from a compliance point of view, but more importantly, or potentially more importantly, this could be a strategic tool that drives decision-making and changes in the business model to reduce the risk and leverage the opportunities. So with this, I'll hand over to Victoria and then to Omar to tell us a bit more about physical risks and then transition risks.
Yes, thank you, Maria. So I'll deep dive a bit more into the details of physical risks. And basically, I'll cover the concepts of exposure to climate hazards, vulnerability, adaptation, and climate scenarios. Next slide, please. So how does one assess or quantify physical risks? There are two main concepts here. You have the exposure to climate hazards on the one hand. The climate hazards we call the external factors to a system that we study, and you have the vulnerability on the other hand, which is dependent on the internal factors of a system. So with a system, I mean it can be an organization that we study to be at risk to physical risks. It could be a portfolio of assets. It could be even an ecosystem, so it can be anything. And so to assess the physical risk, first you have to understand the exposure of this system to climate hazards. And so climate hazards are basically what Maria mentioned before. They are what we call the physical risks, acute and chronic hazards. They are basically the climate and weather phenomena. As a result of climate change. And so you have the acute ones, extreme events, for example, and you have the chronic ones like sea level rise and increasing temperatures. And so the exposure is kind of independent of the characteristics of the system. The only important thing here is really the localization of the systems or the systems parts, like, for example, the assets. So the geographical location is really important, and to know it as precise as possible will allow you to assess the exposure in more detail. And this is because climate hazards, they change the impacts that they have, and their intensity and frequency changes geographically. For some climate hazards, the geographical like the geographical location is even more important, like for example for flooding. Like flooding depends a lot on topography, so the higher the more precise you can locate your assets, the more important it will be on the exposure in the end. And so climate hazards also change the impacts they have, and the exposure changes in time. The more you go into the future, the level of exposure might change, and they change with different climate scenarios. And I'll come to that in another slide. And so this is the exposure to external factors on the one hand. Then once you have assessed the exposure of your system, you want to know if you're actually vulnerable to these climate hazards. And this depends a lot on the internal factors that define a system. And I'm talking, for example, about the size of the system at study, the different components of a system, like, for example, if you're looking at a technological company that owns data centers, the data centers, the computing power, the people working, there's a different subsystems of the entire system. And so these different characteristics, they influence the vulnerability, basically to the vulnerability of the system to these different climate hazards. One also important aspect of vulnerability, which I'll mention later, is adaptation. So basically the adaptive capacity of a system, the resources a system has to be able to adapt to climate change. And together, vulnerability and exposure defines the climate risk or the physical climate risk of the system to different climate hazards. And this risk level can be assessed in a qualitative way by scoring methodologies, by assessing the levels in a qualitative way, but also in a quantitative way when in this case, I'm talking about financial impacts, for example. So if you can assess the impacts in a quantitative way, financially or in other ways, then it's more precise. And it's something I'll give an example later on. In general, this approach is aligned with regulatory frameworks like the TCFD, the CSRD, etc. Next slide, please. So a little bit more in detail again on the exposure to climate hazards. So you have seen, I've mentioned that the climate hazards, they change geographically. The exposure to the climate hazards changes geographically. So the locations of your assets or the system that you want to study is really important. At EcoAct, we have our own in-house developed tools called the EcoAct Climate Risk Platform, which computes for you the exposure of your assets of the system to 28 different climate hazards. And as an input to calculate this exposure, our tool uses the latest state-of-the-art climate projections and climate data and other scientific databases available. We have also in-house 5 different PhDs on climate science to make sure that the information in the platform is quality checked and uses the latest state-of-the-art scientific information. Another important part in this tool, but in general in an exposure assessment, is to look at different scenarios. So you'll have a high emission, low emission scenarios, which you can play with in the tool. And you also can assess the uncertainty and confidence levels of the projections, which is quite important as we, for exposure, if we look into the future, we use model data. And model data, model projections, they are related, they have uncertainties, so they're related to uncertainties. So with our platform, we provide confidence levels for each climate hazard and projection at study. Yes, next slide, please. I have mentioned climate scenarios, so I wanted to say a small word on that. So the climate scenarios used for physical risk, you might have heard about the RCP scenarios or the SSP scenarios. So at EcoAct, we use the RCP scenarios, which stands for representative concentration pathways, and they're driven basically by greenhouse gas emissions. So climate scientists have developed these RCP scenarios as input to global climate models to study climate change. And so they use different pathways of greenhouse gas emissions to come to greenhouse gas concentration levels in the atmosphere. So you can have high concentrations in the atmosphere or low concentrations in the atmosphere. And this relates to the high and low emission scenarios as here in this graph on your right hand side. So for example, the RCP 8.5 scenario is basically the worst case scenario, or it's also called the business as usual scenario, because we are more or less on the path, currently on this path by basically currently we have a projected warming of +3 degrees by end of the century. So this RCP 8.5 scenario is a high emission scenario, and it's basically recommended not only by scientists, but also by regulatory frameworks to be used for physical risk assessments. But then you have other scenarios that have lower emissions. For example, the lowest, most positive one is the RCP 2.6. It relates to a +2 degree warming by end of the century compared to the pre-industrial time period. So basically, to look at the different impacts of climate hazards in time, you can compare also the impacts over the different scenarios. But as a rule of thumb, it's best to look at the highest emission scenario because you like to be prepared also for the worst case impacts. I want to say just a small word on the SSP scenarios. So you have the latest IPCC report. They came up with the shared socioeconomic pathways. these are similar to the RCPs, but a little bit different. So instead of using greenhouse gas emissions as drivers of the scenarios, they look at how the world will actually achieve the greenhouse gas concentration levels in the atmosphere through which socio-economic developments. So for example, what kind of population growth, what kind of urbanization or technological development will lead to a certain greenhouse gas concentration level in the atmosphere. And so the difference between the SSPs and RCPs is not big for the short or medium term even. It's mostly important towards the end of the century. As you can see here in this graph on your right-hand side, that until 2050, 2060, you don't have a huge difference in the scenarios. So it's really towards the end of the century. So even between RCPs and SSPs, you don't have a huge difference on the short and medium terms. But also a takeaway just here is that it's important to look at climate scenarios because the evolution of climate hazards and their impacts, they differ strongly across the scenarios the more you go into the future. Next slide, please. So after exposure, I've mentioned vulnerability as the key concept or the next step towards assessing climate risks. So vulnerability basically is the degree to which a system is susceptible to or unable to cope with the effects of climate change and is affected by internal factors. And these internal factors can be separated in three different categories. So you have the criticality of a system, for example, how financially critical is this system for your business? Because if it's a very financially valuable system, if it's exposed to one or multiple climate hazards, you'll immediately become vulnerable. Or the sensitivity. So basically, is the degree to which a system is susceptible to this, sensitive to the climate hazards. Because, for example, if your system is dependent on water resources, if then the system is exposed to water stress, you will be vulnerable because you're strongly dependent on water resource. So the dependency on natural resources and other characteristics of the system, they define the sensitivity. And the last part is the adaptive capacity. And that's basically the resources you have, the information you have in place already, or you plan to have in place to adapt to the impacts of climate change or to mitigate the impacts of climate change. And so these vulnerability indicators, we call them also internal factors, they are very system dependent and also very site level dependent. Even if it's the same system, a factory in one country will be a bit different than a factory in another country. So at EcoAct, we use what we call the vulnerability self-assessment tool to assist to quantify to quantify these vulnerability indicators. And basically, this is through a certain set of targeted questions to better understand the system and then quantify the vulnerability. It's important here to understand really the data and the gaps that you collect, as this is something really sites level dependent, and depending on how big your organization is, it might take a lot of effort to collect this kind of information. So there will be uncertainties and gaps and assumptions. It's a bit less standard than the exposure part, which is based on climate data. So this is something that you need to take into account when assessing vulnerability. I want to give just three different case studies that from previous projects we did at EcoAct on exposure and vulnerability. So for example, we did a project for a railway company in Europe, and we assessed the exposure and vulnerability of their systems to multiple climate hazards. And for the vulnerability, we assessed more than 100 different subsystems of their organizations to the most critical climate hazards. We have also supported an agricultural and food company in quantifying what we call the climate suitability of crops, which they use as plant-based ingredients for their products. And we have supported a manufacturing company that specializes in specialty materials in assessing the vulnerability of their factories to critical climate hazards. And here we assess the vulnerability at site level for each of their factory through targeted questionnaires and made it specifically on factories. Next slide, please. And so the final step actually in a physical risk assessment is usually the adaptation. And adaptation is quite complex. The simple definition for adaptation is the adjustment of a system to like adjustment of a system as a response to changes in climate. And once you have identified your main physical risks or climate hazards, and you have identified your vulnerability, you want to make a plan to reduce or mitigate your most important impacts, like the most financially important impacts. And so the idea here is then to identify adaptation measures to put in place to mitigate this impact, or assess the adaptation measures that maybe already are in place, if they're effective enough in the future, under future climate change. And why do we want to do an adaptation? Adaptation can be costly, but the idea behind it is that basically the potential, what we call the potential financial impact of climate change, it increases over time. Because, for example, the extreme events, they become more extreme, they become more frequent. So the costs related to those, when those events occur, they will also increase. So basically the financial cost of climate change increases over time if you do nothing. If you put in place adaptation actions in the beginning, you have usually a cost, but the benefits increase over time. And at the same time, you reduce the costs of climate change. So you have in the end still a residual cost of impacts that you could not mitigate. But if you can mitigate the most important ones, usually you can find a balance between the costs and benefits of adaptation actions, and even go towards more benefits. I would like to show two cases from projects that we did. So we have supported a real estate group in assessing climate vulnerability of its assets and developing an adaptation plan to deal with it really at site level. And we have supported a technology company to assess the exposure and vulnerability of their data centers to climate hazards and also prioritize adaptation actions. And here actually it's interesting, we went a step further and we identified the potential of these adaptation actions to mitigate certain risks in the future, where you can really compare, if you do nothing, how big will the risk be? If you put in place an adaptation action now, by how much will this risk be reduced? And so you can make this comparison, and this is beneficial for the adaptation plan you want to focus on. Yes, I am done with this slide, so I'll give to Omer now on transition risks.
Thank you, Victoria, for that piece on physical risk. Transition risk is the other aspect of climate-related risks and opportunities that will be that companies are required to consider. I realize we've got quite a lot to cover and not much time, and so I'll be a bit more quick with my slides. Can I move on to the next one, please? Yeah, so similar to the graph that you saw showing the representative concentration pathways, we can the transition scenarios, or looking at transition risks, can also be done in a similar way. The graph you see on the left-hand side shows different scenarios, each scenario being linked to a certain carbon budget, and each carbon budget associated with a temperature warming figure by the year 2100. If we are on current policies, we'll be reaching around 3 degrees in global warming by 2100. I remember when I first started working in sustainability, it used to be 4 degrees. So we have, whatever little progress we have made, it's already brought it down by 1 degree Celsius to 3 degrees now. However, if we are to reach 1.5 degrees, which is the objective of the Paris Agreement, a lot more needs to be done. We need to reduce our current emissions by a substantially large amount to get to that point. Now, if we're going from a 3-degree world to a 1.5-degree world, that will require quite a lot of effort from our side, and that will also result in quite a lot of changes in the wider economy. For us to get to 1.5 degrees, we're going to need to see higher carbon prices. Those higher carbon prices can lead to more energy supply volatility, because if you're going to put carbon taxes on fossil fuel power generation sources, companies will start investing in more renewable power sources, and renewable power sources will require storage investments, and there will be quite a lot of there will be quite a large energy transformation in the whole world. That energy transformation will also lead to a lot of economic transformation, given how interconnected the whole world is and how different sectors of the economy are. So you can see that if you're going from where we're at in a 3-degree world, if we're going down to a 1.5-degree world, there will be a lot of changes happening in the economy, which can present a transition risk to your business. But at the same time, if your business is positioned appropriately, it can turn those risks into opportunities, depending on where you sit in the value chain, what are your propositions, and how do you plan on capitalizing on those opportunities. Next slide. How could these transition risks and opportunities affect you? So a very standard transition risk for a lot of businesses are carbon prices and energy pricing risks. Let's say your business buys goods and services from other companies, and it also buys electricity, energy for its operations, and it also pays money for like transporting in goods to reach its final customers. In each of these, from each of these angles, you can be subject to increased energy prices or increased carbon prices. For example, if the carbon prices do not directly apply to you, they could apply to your suppliers. And those suppliers may then pass on those additional costs to you. As far as energy prices go, if carbon prices do not apply to you right now, but they do apply to your energy providers, that could increase the cost of your energy bills. And depending on if your energy suppliers are more focused on the renewable side of things, then that leaves you more exposed to the energy supply volatility issues. So will you be able to access renewable energy throughout the day? If you're investing in on-site renewables, how are you going to take care of storage of energy for when the supply of sunlight or wind power is not there and you still need the power to work for your operations? So these examples are just to show you that even if you do not think that transition risks directly affect you, or like carbon energy pricing does not directly affect you, it could very well affect your value chain. And one of the key points of transition risk analysis is to map out your value chain and understand the different angles and avenues by which these risks may affect you, may reach you. And by understanding that, you can then prepare yourself a lot better to mitigate against those risks or take advantage of those opportunities. On the top right side, you'll see some examples of outputs that we've prepared for clients as far as their carbon taxes go, as far as their energy bills go, and what the cost of inaction for them will be in different climate scenarios. If the world transitions to a 1.5 degree world, what would the risks for them be in a financial sense? How much additional money would they be looking to pay as far as carbon taxes go based on their current strategies and current performance? How much extra energy bill will they be required to pay? And what would be the loss of business for them, depending on what type of other risks you want to look at? So far, we have, just quite recently, we've supported a large pharmaceutical company with assessing their carbon and energy pricing exposure across all of their manufacturing and office sites. And we've also helped a tech company understand their energy and carbon pricing exposure across all of their offices, as well as data centers. The data centers is a particularly important consideration these days because of the increased uptick in AI, which has dramatically increased energy consumption for a lot of these companies. And depending on where the energy is being sourced from, or improving the resilience of the energy supply, could lead to a much bigger energy bill for them, and potentially also increased carbon emissions for them. Next slide. So carbon energy prices are quite easy to quantify. We have a lot of data sets covering them, and they're quite easily overlaid with your business's performance in both environmental and economic. However, there exists a whole suite of transition risks and opportunities which are a bit more difficult to quantify. For them, we usually take quite a bespoke approach, depending on the client's requirements, depending on their business model, depending on what they see as the most material issue. Some difficult to quantify risks and opportunities are reputation, the resilience and future demand of your products and services, litigation exposure, client-based performance, or how are your clients going to perform in different climate scenarios, and what would that mean for your business. Enhanced reporting obligations, we just talked about all the mandatory reporting requirements all over the world, and there would be an additional cost associated with those reporting requirements, as well as potential penalties and fines for not meeting those targets. And stakeholder expectations. So what do your suppliers expect from you? What do your customers expect from you? What do the regulators, what do your investors expect from you? Quantifying that as well can be a bit of a challenge. And the general principles for how we approach the quantification process is firstly to understand the drivers for those risks. So where is the push coming from? Is it decarbonization targets? Is it public pressure? Is it pressure from investors? Is it public groups, NGOs, governments? Where's the pressure coming from? What's driving this? And then understanding your exposure and the channels via which these risks affect you. So is it a financial risk? Is it a reputational risk? Does the reputation then affect your finances? Things like that. And then finally, developing models to assess how those different drivers and variables can affect your business in different climate scenarios. So in a 1.5 degree world, if there's going to be higher carbon prices, there's going to be more energy supply volatility, what could that mean for your business? If your products are producing more carbon emissions than they would have otherwise, what would that mean from a reputation perspective? Looking at global GDP in different scenarios, things like that. And other use cases and most recently, we've helped a client quantify the financial impact of their climate-related reputation risks. So if the client was to not meet their climate-related targets, what would be the risks to them from a reputational standpoint? In a dollar value. Next slide. So yes, beyond the regulatory landscape, so far we've talked about transition risks and opportunities, mainly from a reporting perspective and assessment perspective, but there's also an opportunity for you to look at climate-related transition risks and opportunities as a way to enhance the value of your company, as well as to take advantage of opportunities out there that aren't currently on the horizon for your business right now. Next slide. So I've referenced the global energy transition, if we were to go from a 3 degree world to a 1.5 degree world. Now, an estimate from BNEF says that it will cost us about $215 trillion to reach that target by 2050, if we were to transition from today. Figures from other sources are around the same level, over 200 trillion. Now, when you see 200 trillion, you're thinking of it more of as a cost, like who's going to pay for this? But depending on where your business lies in the value chain, that $250 trillion cost could be a $250 trillion investment. That could be a $250 trillion opportunity for your business to take advantage of as we transition towards a more sustainable future. And more recently, and I know we're talking about long time horizons, but it is already happening. It is already in place. If we look at the metals industry last year, there was a 30% increase in demand of lithium. Nickel, cobalt, and graphite, and other rare elements, their demand increased between 8 to 15%. Electric vehicles, this is a very topical subject all over the world. Last year, around 1 in every 5 cars sold was an electric vehicle. And according to NGFS Net Zero 2050 scenarios, NGFS stands for the Network for Greening the Financial System. They provide scenarios and databases for financial institutions to help them prepare and assess their climate-related risks and opportunities in different climate scenarios. According to them, energy use for electricity in the transportation sector stands to increase anywhere between 13 times from what it is today to about 30 times by 2050, which goes to show the potential for EVs in a 1.5 degree future. Similarly, from the NGFS Net Zero 2050 scenarios, renewable energy can increase anywhere between 8 to 10 times of its capacity today, while at the same time, energy generated from non-renewable sources is expected to go down to 20% of what it is today. So if we are to, there is a global energy transition. The rate of that is subject to some scrutiny, but it is undeniable that the transition does exist. And depending on where you're at and how you develop your strategy, you could take advantage of that. Next slide, please. So yeah, here I've got two examples for you from the market currently on how these opportunities are affecting the market today. A very popular example is Tesla. We look at the price to sales ratio, or the ratio of market capitalization, the value of the company against the revenues of the company, and we see that Tesla's value is so much higher than a lot of its other larger competitors and peers. And one reason for that is because Tesla is more aligned to a 1.5 degree future. It is more future proof. It is more climate transition risk resilient. And that gives investors a lot of confidence in investing in Tesla. And that's what drives the value of the stock higher. On the revenue generation side of things, we have Vattenfall, which is an energy generation company. As you can see in the graph, that the revenues were more or less going downwards all the way up to 2017, at which point they phased out their lignite operations and invested more in renewables, which led to them achieving their highest revenues in their history in 2022 and 2023. And that happened in the context of the fact that in 2022, there was an additional 300 gigawatt of renewable energy added globally, and which accounted for 83% of all new generation capacity that year. And the remaining of the 17% was fossil fuels. So again, touching on the point of the transition to more renewable sources, it is already happening. The rate at which it is happening can be different, but there is an undeniable move to this 1.5 degree world. And the question then becomes, how does your business prepare for that? On that note, I'll hand it over to Charlotte.
Awesome. So Maria briefly mentioned the opportunities related to a company's efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And then Omer shared several examples for how these opportunities are impacting the market. Now the question really is, so how can you measure and manage these climate risks for your organization? So next slide. So to measure your climate risks, there are several steps involved. It's really important to have expert input to ensure all the relevant risks and opportunities are identified. This should include your core sustainability or ESG team, as well as internal stakeholders for each respective risk or opportunity type. This would be like legal, R&D, and others. You should also consider including external climate risk experts if additional expertise is needed. The next step, forecasting evaluation. These are really necessary to predict the impact or exposure of the risk itself, and really to enable you to model the scenarios that we've been talking about and understand the risk factors. So this climate-related scenario analysis really allows the development of pathways to explore a range of potential impacts from climate change on your own operations, including your finances and also your supply chain. So scenario analysis is really a tool that can help you develop strategies to mitigate climate-related impacts. And speaking of tools, this is really the final step that enables the quantification of risks as well as the opportunities. So the selected assessment tool should really depend on a range of factors, such as your organization's prioritization approach, your preference for severity metrics, time horizon of the risks, and also the type of risk that's being assessed. So with that, let's move to the next slide, and we'll talk about managing climate risks. So now that we've spoken about measuring, we'll kind of talk through how you can manage those risks from engagement to disclosure. On this slide, you'll kind of see on the right-hand side a little word that says repeat. This is really because the management of climate risks and opportunities should be handled on a continual basis. This will really enable your organization to integrate prioritized risks and opportunities into your enterprise risk management processes and overall business strategy. So starting with engage, it's really important to engage with your organizational departments on an annual basis. This is really at a minimum, should probably doing it maybe on a quarterly basis if feasible. especially at like quarterly business review meetings, for example. So this is important to really understand the change in climate and to build consensus on the methods needed to not only adapt, but to also mitigate the risks and take advantage of opportunities in a timely manner. The next one, assess. These department leads or stakeholders should not only be informed, but should be involved in the assessment phase to ensure all material risks and opportunities are prioritized effectively. You don't want to accidentally forget a risk or opportunity. You may just need to make sure that you're being very comprehensive, because as you're working to adapt the organization's business strategy using the scenario analysis results, these stakeholders really may be the functional risk owners and thus become responsible for implementing these climate-related initiatives to take advantage of the opportunities and to mitigate or adapt to the risks. It's important for these folks to really understand the impact values to build and then also share a business case, especially for leadership's approval, because the leadership approval is really the key at the end to providing a comprehensive and transparent disclosure document for your investors and then also other external stakeholders, whether it's for compliance purposes like we've spoken about or also for voluntary purposes. You could follow a TCFD or also IFRS S2 format for voluntary purposes. From our perspective, it's really recommended that leadership be given regular updates throughout the entire process. It really means for a smoother integration if you do so. And then just keep in mind that the prioritized risks and climate risks and opportunities, as well as potential next steps for enhancing resilience, may actually happen over a longer period of time than you're used to. So the results of climate risk assessment will really need to be embedded into the overall governance model to ensure they're implemented and not forgotten about in the long run. So with that, next slide. So here's an example from a client that we've worked with this year actually to identify, assess, and prioritize climate-related risks and opportunities to align with upcoming climate regulations. So that was their main driver, and also create their first TCFD aligned report. So for Charles River Labs, it was really a challenge for them to understand the exposure to climate risks over the time horizons that I've really just talked about a little bit. And so we worked with them to map their risks and opportunities for 3 different climate scenarios. We also developed indicators for them to monitor the change in climate to determine the scenarios that relate to the pathway in real life in the future as they work towards mitigating and adapting their risks and taking advantage of the opportunities, as well as held interviews with their internal stakeholders to create a timeline for each to carry out their respective initiatives to manage and realize the risks and opportunities. So the impact of the overall project really enabled the company, in this case, Charles River Labs, to effectively carry out master planning for their sites, and then also help to facilitate an understanding of preparedness for upcoming climate regulations. So I think we're ready to move on to Q&A. I'm not sure if Marie wants to take that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Charlotte, and Omar and Victoria for all these insights on physical transition risk, strategic implications, and integrating that within business as usual practice. So we have a bit less than 10 minutes for some questions, and there's been quite a few coming through the chat. So maybe just to get us started, first question around my company already has a physical risk analysis produced in the framework of the business continuity system and emergency measures. How do I integrate with the proposed methodology? Maybe I'll get us started on this question, and then I'll look at Charlotte and Victoria to see if you want to add anything based as it relates to integration. So I would say a key, like looking at physical risk in the context of business continuity is a great first step. It means that you have looked at current state, current impacts, and where major risks might be. What's critical in terms of preparing for future climate is looking at the different scenarios and time horizons, looking at a longer term that usually we look at within business continuity and emergency measures, because as Victoria explained, we expect climate hazards to evolve and change significantly, especially when we look at the high carbon scenario. So I'd say next step would be embedding the kind of climate scenario considerations within that initial assessment. But Victoria, Charlotte, anything you'd like to add?
I think you answered great. Maybe we could always check, do a gap assessment to check if the approach you have already used, because we don't know what approach you use. Maybe it's already answering a lot of details. So scenarios are most important. The future aspect for climate risk are most important, and where possible, the latest climate data is also important to use. So I think that's a good summary.
Yeah, and as part of that, I think it's really important for you to really assess materiality. There will be many risks and opportunities, and it might seem a little overwhelming. So definitely prioritize to just stay on track and actually take baby steps, because it takes time.
Great, thanks Charlotte for that. So moving to the other type of risks, and I guess that's a question for Omar here. How do you mitigate the impacts of transition risks?
Great question. So it is a step-by-step process. Mitigation of transition risks requires you to first understand your transition risks. And the initial process is firstly to understand what are the most material transition risks for your business. We typically do that through a qualitative analysis where we work closely with key stakeholders across different functions, across your business, to try and understand what are all the different angles through which climate transition risks could affect your business. Once we have that, we do a very high-level analysis to see which of these risks would be the most material ones. And then whichever are the most material ones, we then try to quantify the impact of those transition risks. So if that risk were to materialize, what would be the financial impact of that to your business? And once we have that across a low carbon scenario, a medium carbon scenario, and a high carbon scenario, then your business would be well equipped to make a judgment on how to best go about mitigating it in terms of, well, if the risk is 10 billion, but you can mitigate against it by just investing 1 million, that is a no-brainer for you. But if the risk is 1 million, but mitigation of it will cost you $50 million because you need to transform your whole business, then that's not a way to go about it. So it is a step-by-step process, and it starts with climate change, but then it quickly becomes a part of your business and strategy planning, and that takes the form of a transition plan usually at the end of the exercise.
Great, glad you mentioned transition plans, as I guess there's quite a strong link and quite a lot of focus on starting the planning for risks at the moment. So another area that's getting a lot of more attention and is becoming increasingly important, and one of the reasons why the TCFD and other frameworks were created was on financial impacts of climate risks. So a question related to, first to Omar, as we're with you, and then to Victoria on financial impacts. How do you financially quantify transition risks in a repeatable fashion?
So that, again, very much depends on the business. Usually with transition risk quantification, for hard to quantify risks, it's the reason why they're hard to quantify is because they are very bespoke, and it does require a little bit of tailoring of the methodology to make it appropriate for your business. If I'm quantifying a risk for a consulting service, it is going to look very different to how I would quantify it for a manufacturing company. Once we do it for that company, unless their business model changes substantially, that the findings of that should hold. The TCFD recommends conducting a climate scenario analysis every 3 years, or when your business undergoes a substantial transformation. So to do it in a repeatable fashion, unless your business changes, the methodology should still hold. But if we're looking at different sectors, different operating models, the methodologies will be different. And one of the key reasons why we work quite closely with our clients as part of this process is, yes, we can come up with a standardized methodology, but we prefer to have it very tailored to that particular client so that they can take ownership of it and move it forward within their business, so that when the business does get to a transition plan development stage, they own the figures, they understand why they've done what they've done and why they need to do what they need to do.
Great, yeah, I guess that owning part of it, it's key there. So related question then, Victoria, on physical risk, and how do you financially quantify financial risk for physical risk from taking a bottom-up vulnerability approach? Sorry, didn't phrase that quite straightforward.
No, thanks, Maya. No, it's a very good question. it's indeed complicated to do it because financial impacts for physical risk, they depend, of course, on the business type, on the system at study, so the vulnerability aspects, but it also depends on the climate hazards because each climate hazard has a different type of impact. And so what you need to do is actually relate this potential impact or the type of impact of a climate hazard to your business. So I'll give an example. So for example, if your business or your sites are depend on water consumption, if you remember my example from the vulnerability, and these sites are also exposed to water stress. So the type of impact that water stress might have is that it can lead to closure of your sites if there is a drought, for example, a significant drought. So the closure of your sites, that's the physical impact. And so we want to quantify it financially. For that, we need information through like bottom-up vulnerability interviews with site managers. So we want to collect as much information as possible. When would the site be closed? Under what threshold of water consumption, water stress in that area? Once we can have this information, we relate then the water stress levels projected in the future with the potential possibility of closure of your sites based on vulnerability information that we have collected. And then we can financially quantify it by saying, okay, if the site is closed one day, if the site is closed a week, this will potentially cost the company this amount of money. So this is basically the basic approach, but it's really different per climate hazard, and that makes it kind of complex.
Thanks, Victoria. So I guess a tricky issue to address. So we have just 1 minute left. So I'm going to go for one question more and just ask anyone to jump in with a very quick response, just to make it a bit more fun. So final question, for consulting services firm with offices across many countries, how can risk and opportunities be conducted so that it covers all locations?
Oh, I'm actually doing that for a client right now. That is one of my projects. So for a consulting services firm with offices across many countries, as far as physical risk analysis goes, site level analysis can be done quite quickly with EcoRx Eclair tool. Just enter the coordinates of the office and it will give out a bunch of results for you across many different types of climate hazards. And that's pretty straightforward that we do that. As far as transition risk goes, that again very much depends on the company and the consulting services. If they've got clients across a wide range of sectors, then one way you could look at it is to see how those different sectors may evolve. If 90% of your revenue comes from oil and gas sector, and a 1.5 degree world, oil and gas sector isn't expected to do very well, then that is a massive risk for your business. If your business is exposed to the renewables industry more, then you stand to gain a lot more in that space. And there exists a whole world in between that, where if a lot of your clients are oil and gas, but you are looking to transition, to help them transition to renewables, that is how you convert that risk into an opportunity within that climate scenario. Other types of risks that also exist for our consulting services, you're looking at potentially higher energy costs from their offices, more carbon emissions, more traveling costs because of increased carbon prices. You'll be looking at, and this is one related to physical risks, decrease in productivity due to heat stress in different countries. So this is particularly important for places like the UK, where we don't have ACs in our homes. So heat stress is a real thing here. Let's hope to not ever experience the 40 degrees heat wave that we had a couple of years ago. But there's a whole range of transition risks and opportunities, depending on what the consulting services firm sees as material. And then we can move to the quantification stage of that.
Thanks, Omar. I think that covered everything. Charlotte, Victoria, jump in if you want for any final comments.
Maybe one final comment, physical risks. I think the most challenging is, we have the climate data is global, climate hazard exposure is global, so we can assess all your firms. However, the trick here is if you have really the location of each of your assets. In the supply chain, it might be a problem, but we push our clients to really engage with their suppliers and even upstream suppliers to really find out where they're located so we can do a proper assessment through interviews. Yeah, very short question.
And one of the key places to start with that too is if you have an insurance document, something like that, often they'll actually have a value, especially on some of your key assets. So those are some of the values and things that we'll ask for if you were to work with a consulting firm on something like that. And as part of involving everyone throughout the different departments, if you're global, it's really important for us to have the opportunities to actually interview and speak with various folks throughout your different departments to have the global impact throughout the different business units that Omer just talked about.
Perfect. Thanks, all of you, Omar, Victoria, and Charlotte. And I think with this, we'll wrap up session today with 3 minutes over. But I wanted to thank everyone in the audience for joining us today and for all your questions. We will get back to you on the questions that we have not been able to answer, so just please bear with us. And yeah, thank you very much for joining today, and hope you have a nice rest of the day. Thank you.